Human beings do not simply work for money. They work for the sense of safety that money promises. At its deepest root, money is not just a string of numbers on a screen or ink printed on paper. It is the modern symbol of survival. In the ancient world, people feared hunger, cold, exposure. In the modern world, those fears have only changed their costumes. They reappear as the fear of unemployment, the fear of unpaid bills, the fear of losing social standing. That is why money has become the most sophisticated instrument of power. It strikes directly at the primal instinct to survive. Observe any society, and you will see the same phenomenon repeat itself. The wealthy rarely need to threaten directly. They do not need to raise their voices. Their presence alone creates a kind of invisible gravity. Everyone around them knows that they control something universal, the flow of security. When a wealthy figure enters a room, eyes turn not only out of admiration, but out of a silent fear. Fear that offending them will mean losing opportunity, losing access, losing the fragile net of safety that money weaves. Here lies the essence of what Machiavelli understood centuries ago. People do not obey because they admire. They obey because they fear the consequences of losing protection. Money sharpens this mechanism. Unlike brute force, money does not wound the body. It wounds stability. It threatens comfort, status, continuity. And that kind of wound is far more terrifying because it is invisible, yet inescapable. You can resist a sword with courage. You can resist a tyrant with rebellion. But how do you resist the slow erosion of your lifestyle when income dries up? Most cannot. That is why they submit, often without realizing it. The psychology of fear and money begins with dependency. Dependency is the quiet chain that ties one person to another. Most workers are not terrified of their boss because the boss is violent. They are terrified because the boss signs the paycheck. The contract may be paper, but the binding power is psychological. The mind calculates, if this money stops, how long until my life unravels? That question produces obedience faster than any whip ever could. Machiavelli would argue this is the purest form of control because it does not require force. It requires only the management of expectation and access. What makes money such an efficient lever of obedience is its universality. People differ in ideology, values, or culture, but money speaks a language everyone understands. It bypasses debate and appeals directly to fear, the fear of losing what one already has. Studies in behavioral economics confirm this ancient truth. Loss aversion, the idea that people fear losing more than they desire. Gaining governs much of human decision-making. A promise of gain motivates, but a threat of loss enslaves. The wealthy rarely need to promise. All they need is to let others imagine the void that would open if financial support disappeared. That imagination is enough. A man may endure hardship if he has always been poor, but once he tastes comfort, once his lifestyle fuses with his sense of self, he becomes vulnerable. He is no longer working for money. He is working to avoid falling backwards, and falling backwards feels like death, even if it is only social death. This is the hidden fear that binds people to the wealthy. They obey not to rise higher, but to avoid sinking lower. Machiavelli knew the difference. He saw that it is not ambition that governs the masses, but terror of decline. Notice how silence itself becomes power in this system. A wealthy individual does not need to scold. A delayed payment, an unanswered call, the faint suggestion that a contract might not renew, these subtle signals trigger waves of anxiety. The mind fills in the gaps. Am I losing my place? Have I fallen out of favor? This anxiety bends behavior more effectively than explicit threats because it forces the individual to discipline themselves. They censor their own words, adjust their own tone, police their own loyalty, all to preserve access to the financial lifeline. Machiavelli would call this elegant domination, control without visible chains. Wealth also introduces asymmetry. In theory, contracts and agreements create balance between parties, but in practice, the side with deeper reserves always holds the upper hand. A rich merchant can wait out a crisis. A poor trader cannot. A wealthy patron can fund allies for years. a struggling client cannot survive a single missed opportunity. This imbalance generates quiet obedience, not because the poor lack pride, but because they lack the cushion to resist. In every relationship where one side controls the flow of money, the other side slowly bends, whether they admit it or not. Here emerges the darker psychology. Money is not only security, it is identity. When people reach a certain standard of living, they begin to merge who they are with what they can afford. Their clothes, their home, their travels, their access to networks, all become extensions of self. Remove the money, and they feel as though their identity itself is stripped away. That is why people obey the wealthy with such fervor. It is not simply about survival. It is about preserving the illusion of self that their wealth sustains. To threaten their income is to threaten their very sense of existence. Machiavelli understood that the greatest rulers never rely on fear of death alone. They rely on fear of loss, the fear of losing honor, losing standing, losing the life one has grown accustomed to. Modern wealth weaponizes this instinct perfectly. Employees, partners, dependents. None of them wish to risk losing the privileges money allows. So they adapt, often against their own interests, because comfort once tasted is more intoxicating than ambition ever was. Fear of poverty motivates the poor to work. Fear of losing wealth enslaves the comfortable far more tightly. But why do people obey the wealthy beyond economics? Because money creates an aura of inevitability. It is not just the possession of wealth, but the perception that wealth will continue to flow. People respect momentum. A rich man is assumed to be wise simply because he is rich. A rich woman is assumed to be disciplined, intelligent, deserving. This assumption is rarely examined. It is a psychological shortcut. If they have money, they must know something I do not. That deference creates obedience, not through logic, but through the silent belief that opposing wealth is opposing reality itself. This is why wealth and fear are inseparable. Fear is not always loud. Most of the time, it is quiet, internalized, disguised as respect, loyalty, or even admiration. Yet, peel back the mask, and what you find is simple. Obedience rooted in anxiety. Anxiety about survival, status, and identity. The wealthy, knowingly or not, become the architects of this anxiety. They do not need to conquer. They only need to preserve the conditions under which people believe they cannot survive without them. And so, money is not power in itself. It is the most refined amplifier of fear. It turns hesitation into compliance, ambition into dependence, pride into silence. People obey the wealthy because wealth manipulates the most ancient emotion of all, the fear of losing what one cannot imagine living without. That is why, as Machiavelli would argue, the true master is not the one who owns the gold, but the one who makes others fear its absence. Fear alone does not explain why people obey the wealthy. Fear is the spark, but the machinery that keeps obedience running is far more complex. To understand it, we must look at how money interacts with psychology, status, and dependency. Machiavelli observed that people rarely submit openly to force for long. They resist, rebel, or plot revenge. But when they submit to wealth, they do so quietly, almost willingly, because wealth does not feel like oppression, it feels like opportunity. That is the subtle trick. Money disguises domination as benevolence. Think of the patronage systems of old Florence or Rome. Lords and princes did not need to terrorize their subjects with soldiers in the street. They offered stipends, offices, and pensions. And with every gift, every privilege, they tightened the leash. Those who benefited rarely called themselves slaves. They called themselves allies, friends, or dependents. But the effect was the same. Their lives orbited the patron who held the purse. What made this system so enduring was that obedience did not feel like obedience. It felt like gratitude. This is the most powerful psychological device money produces. The illusion that one is choosing freely, when in reality, one is trapped by comfort. Modern corporations replicate the same dynamic. An employee does not stay simply because of salary. They stay because of the lifestyle salary sustains. mortgage, tuition, insurance, each expense becomes a shackle. The worker convinces themselves they are free because they can resign at any moment, but resignation would mean dismantling the life they have built. So they remain, not because they love the work, but because they fear the collapse of identity. That is, obedience manufactured by money, dressed in the illusion of free choice. Machiavelli would smirk at this, for he knew people are most controllable when they believe they are free. Yet fear and gratitude are only the foundation. To fully explain obedience, we must turn to the symbolic dimension of wealth. Money does not only buy goods, it buys perception. The wealthy radiate a signal that others interpret as competence, superiority, even destiny. This is why leaders flaunt generosity or luxury, not because they need applause, but because the spectacle persuades the masses that their power is inevitable. When people see wealth displayed, they do not calculate the debt, the loans, or the risks. They see proof of victory, and people obey victory because aligning with it feels safer than opposing it. This is where Machiavelli's principle of appearances becomes crucial. He argued that rulers should not strive to be virtuous, but to appear virtuous. Likewise, the wealthy do not need to be powerful in essence. They need only appear untouchable. The appearance alone reshapes behavior. Subordinates defer more, competitors hesitate, allies cling closer. Wealth in this sense is less about possession and more about stagecraft. It is theater that engineers obedience by convincing people that resistance is futile. But money does more than manipulate perception. It rewires trust. People trust the wealthy because money creates a shortcut in judgment. Instead of evaluating someone's character, discipline, or wisdom, they assume wealth is proof of those things. This misplaced trust is fertile ground for control. A wealthy figure need not argue persuasively. Their wealth does the persuasion. Their mere ability to spend, to sustain, to invest is treated as validation. And once trust is seated, obedience follows naturally. People obey not because they are ordered, but because they are convinced. The machinery of obedience also thrives on the asymmetry of risk. For the wealthy, money is a buffer. For the dependent, money is survival. This imbalance skews every negotiation. Imagine a landlord and a tenant. For the landlord, rent is income. For the tenant, rent is stability, dignity, and shelter. If the landlord threatens eviction, the tenant panics, even if the landlord risks only minor inconvenience. The same imbalance appears in business partnerships, employment contracts, or even friendships. The side with deeper reserves controls the tempo. They can afford delay, risk, or loss. The weaker side cannot, so they obey, not because they wish to, but because they cannot afford not to. At this point, we begin to see why obedience to wealth often outlasts obedience to authority. Political rulers fall when armies defect. Religious leaders fall when belief crumbles. But wealthy patrons endure because their power is stitched into the daily survival of others. As long as people need money, they need the wealthy, and as long as they need the wealthy, they obey. Machiavelli would call this a structural form of dominance, power rooted not in force or faith, but in the architecture of necessity. Fear, gratitude, perception, trust, asymmetry, these gears turn together to create the machine of obedience. But there is still one more cog: aspiration. People obey not only out of fear of loss, but also out of hope for gain. Wealth dangles the possibility of elevation. If I stay loyal, I might be rewarded. This hope softens obedience, disguising it as ambition. Machiavelli observed that rulers must always keep subjects hopeful. Too much despair breeds rebellion. Too much satisfaction breeds independence. Hope is the balance. Enough reward to keep them striving, but never enough to make them free. This principle lives on in modern incentives. Bonuses, promotions, commissions, they are designed not to liberate, but to bind. An employee chasing a bonus works harder, but also ties themselves deeper into the system. The dream of advancement blinds them to the reality of dependence. In this way, aspiration becomes another leash, one voluntarily embraced. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They do not need to suppress ambition. They need only redirect it toward prizes they control. At the deepest level, obedience to wealth is a negotiation with fear. Fear of loss, fear of exclusion, fear of insignificance. But it is also a seduction by comfort, by recognition, by hope. This duality is what makes money so much more powerful than violence. Violence compels only while it is applied. Wealth compels even in absence. You need not be whipped to remember who feeds you. You need not be threatened to know who signs the check. The reminder is already inside you, in the rhythm of your bills, your obligations, your desires. And this is the ultimate Machiavellian insight. Wealth governs, not because it commands, but because it infiltrates the imagination. It shapes how people think about themselves, their future, their safety. It makes them police their own behavior, restrain their own impulses, obey without being told. The tyrant needs soldiers, the wealthy need only accountants. The tyrant needs fear visible on the streets. The wealthy create fear, hidden in the private mind of every dependent soul. That is why obedience to money is the most enduring obedience of all. It is invisible, internal, and voluntary. To question this system is difficult, because money also funds the very comforts that numb resistance. A citizen may resent the rich, but still shop in their stores, work in their companies, consume their entertainment. Dependency breeds contradiction. You hate the hand that feeds you, yet you keep returning to it. Machiavelli saw this paradox clearly. People complain of oppression, but rarely sever the ties that sustain their comforts, and so they remain obedient, trapped by both resentment and reliance. Thus, the machinery of obedience is not built on iron or fire. It is built on the psychology of fear and the architecture of dependency. The wealthy do not force obedience. They engineer conditions where obedience feels like the only rational choice. And as long as money defines survival, people will bow, not to kings, not to priests, but to those who control the flow of wealth. That is the true throne of the modern age. If money is the architecture of obedience, then fear is the cement that holds the structure together. Machiavelli taught that fear, unlike love, is predictable. Love is fragile, shifting with mood and circumstance, but fear is steady. Once anchored to survival, it guides behavior with ruthless consistency. That is why the wealthy, whether consciously or instinctively, learn to harness fear not as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool of preservation. They do not seek to terrify openly. They cultivate subtle forms of anxiety, the kind that seeps quietly into the routines of daily life until obedience becomes reflex. Consider how financial systems operate. Debt, interest, taxation, all are built not merely to generate revenue, but to instill discipline. A debtor does not need to be whipped to keep paying. The fear of default, the fear of humiliation, the fear of losing what has already been built, these are enough to keep them working tirelessly. In fact, the debtor polices themselves more effectively than any enforcer could. They plan their lives around repayment. They adjust their ambitions to match obligations. They surrender autonomy not under visible compulsion, but under invisible fear. For Machiavelli, this is the genius of money. It enlists fear to create voluntary servitude. We can see the same principle in the corporate ladder. Promotions are not simply incentives, they are mechanisms of fear. For every level gained, there is more to lose. The manager fears slipping back into the ranks of employees. The executive fears dismissal and the collapse of reputation. With each step upward, the leash tightens, not loosens. Wealth amplifies this anxiety because wealth raises the stakes of falling. The higher one climbs, the deeper the imagined fall. And so the ambitious worker becomes, paradoxically, more obedient, more careful, more pliant as they rise. The wealthy understand this cycle. They do not merely reward success. They cultivate fear of reversal, ensuring loyalty grows alongside prosperity. Fear also explains why displays of wealth carry such psychological weight. When someone flaunts abundance, it is not only meant to impress, it is meant to remind others of what they lack and of what they could lose if they resist. A luxury car, a a sprawling estate, a tailored suit. These are not just symbols of victory. They are subtle threats, silent reminders of disparity. The message is clear. I can afford what you cannot. I can remove your security faster than you can remove mine. People obey not because they are dazzled, but because they feel the cold edge of inferiority sharpened against their pride. Yet Machiavelli would caution against raw intimidation. Too much fear breeds desperation, and desperation is dangerous. The truly strategic use of fear is balanced, almost invisible. The wealthy create conditions where fear is ever present but rarely acknowledged. Payments are delayed just enough to keep partners attentive. Opportunities are distributed selectively to keep rivals guessing. Praise is withheld to sustain anxiety about favor. Each action is minor, but together they create an environment of quiet unease. The subject never feels safe enough to act independently, nor threatened enough to rebel. They exist in a twilight state, dependent, cautious, obedient. This strategy extends beyond individuals into entire societies. Governments know that financial uncertainty disciplines populations better than soldiers in the streets. The threat of recession, inflation, unemployment, these macroeconomic fears regulate behavior at scale. Citizens tighten spending, moderate speech, lower expectations. They obey not because laws demand it, but because fear whispers, "Do not risk what little you have." Machiavelli would recognize this as statecraft by design. He argued that rulers must appear as protectors while quietly cultivating dependence. Wealth today fulfills that role perfectly, offering protection while anchoring obedience through the constant fear of loss. But perhaps the most potent fear is not the fear of poverty, but the fear of irrelevance. In a world where money equals status, losing wealth means losing identity. People obey the wealthy not only to protect their livelihood, but to protect their sense of being someone who matters. Strip a man of wealth, and you strip him of voice, visibility, influence. He becomes invisible in the eyes of others, and often in his own. That fear drives obedience with extraordinary force, because no one wants to become a ghost in a society that worships success. The wealthy exploit this by making themselves the gatekeepers of recognition. They fund projects, sponsor events, allocate opportunities. To be seen, one must orbit them. To be heard, one must appeal to them. In this way, money becomes not just a tool of survival, but a filter of significance. People obey not because they fear hunger, but because they fear fading into obscurity. And that fear, Machiavelli would argue, is even more binding than material dependence, because it chains the ego itself. Fear is also weaponized in silence. When a wealthy patron withdraws attention, the effect is immediate. The dependent wonders, "What did I do wrong? Have I lost favor? Am I being replaced?" This uncertainty gnaws at the mind, producing obedience through anticipation. The subject strives harder, speaks softer, clings closer, not because of an explicit command, but because of the silent terror of exclusion. This is control at its finest, when absence governs more powerfully than presence. Machiavelli admired this kind of subtlety, for it allows rulers to shape behavior without lifting a hand. The brilliance of fear, as a strategic tool, lies in its compounding nature. Once instilled, it requires little reinforcement. The subject internalizes it, rehearses it, and passes it down. Parents teach children to obey financial realities. Employees caution peers to avoid mistakes. Citizens regulate one another through social comparison. Fear becomes cultural, embedded in norms, traditions, even morality. At that point, the wealthy no longer need to enforce obedience. Society enforces it on their behalf. This is why wealth can rule for generations. The initial act of instilling fear multiplies into a self-sustaining system of control. Yet for all its effectiveness, fear must remain carefully managed. Too much instability and the system collapses into chaos. Too little fear and independence grows. The wealthy who endure are those who master balance, giving enough comfort to secure loyalty, enough instability to maintain caution, enough aspiration to keep people striving. Machiavelli's wisdom was not in celebrating cruelty, but in recognizing that fear, precisely measured, is more durable than love. Love fades with disappointment. Fear endures with every bill, every contract, every fragile dream of stability. So why do people obey the wealthy? Because money is not just resource. It is fear materialized. It is the silent reminder of what can be taken away. It is the invisible hand hovering over comfort, reputation, and identity. People obey not out of respect for character or admiration for virtue, but because they cannot bear to imagine the abyss that opens when wealth disappears. Machiavelli would call this the highest form of mastery, when obedience flows not from force, but from the quiet terror that life without you is unlivable. If fear is the tool and money the architecture, then illusion is the curtain that hides the chains. The most enduring obedience is not the kind that admits itself as obedience. It is the kind disguised as freedom. Machiavelli understood this paradox intimately. He warned that people must never feel enslaved, even when they are. Give them the appearance of choice, and they will defend their chains as if they were ornaments. Wealth, more than any sword, perfects this art of illusion. The illusion begins with opportunity. The wealthy scatter tokens of possibility: jobs, contracts, loans, sponsorships, like breadcrumbs on the floor. The dependent picks them up eagerly, believing themselves lucky, believing they have chosen their path. But in truth, the path was designed. The choice was predetermined. Every option leads back to the wealthy, because the wealthy own the ground on which the game is played. A man may choose one employer over another, one bank over another, one investor over another, but all choices funnel back to the same structure: dependence on wealth itself. The illusion of freedom keeps him obedient because he feels agency where there is none. The second layer of illusion is hope. Hope convinces the subject that obedience today will buy freedom tomorrow. Work hard, save diligently, climb patiently, and someday you too will be wealthy enough to command rather than obey. This promise sustains countless lives, yet it is rarely fulfilled. For every one who ascends, thousands remain tethered. The system is designed this way. There must be more dreamers than achievers, more servants than masters. If everyone reached the summit, there would be no one left to obey. So the wealthy sell hope not as truth, but as strategy. They keep the masses docile by dangling the dream of escape, even as they fortify the walls. Machiavelli knew this tactic well. He argued that rulers must always leave subjects with the hope of advancement, but never enough advancement to make them independent. Consumption provides the third illusion. By surrounding people with objects of desire, wealth persuades them that they are free simply because they can buy. The latest phone, the newest car, the fashionable watch, these become badges of autonomy. Look, the subject says, I have chosen. But what they fail to see is that their choice was orchestrated by marketing, credit systems, and social pressure, all funded and controlled by the wealthy. The subject feels powerful in the act of consumption, yet every purchase deepens their dependence. They work harder to pay for what they have bought, obey longer to maintain what they now own. The illusion of freedom through consumption is perhaps the most elegant trap. People obey not to avoid pain, but to preserve pleasure. And still, the wealthiest layer of illusion remains recognition. People equate visibility with freedom. They post, share, display, convinced that attention is liberation. But the platforms they use, the media they consume, the currencies of status they chase, all are owned by wealth. Recognition itself becomes another leash, administered by those who decide what is seen, what is valued, what is forgotten. A person may feel free because thousands applaud their image, but behind the stage, the wealthy control the spotlight. When the light shifts, the applause fades, and the supposed freedom evaporates. Machiavelli would call this the ultimate performance, when even vanity is domesticated by wealth. At this stage, obedience has become so internalized that no external command is required. People police themselves. They sacrifice their time willingly. They censor their thoughts, without being told. They defend the system that binds them because they believe it sustains them. The chains are no longer iron. They are psychological, woven into fear of loss, desire for comfort, and illusion of choice. This is why obedience to the wealthy is not fragile, like obedience to tyrants. It does not require armies or prisons. It requires only the quiet maintenance of illusions. But what of those who resist? Machiavelli would note that resistance always exists, but it rarely succeeds unless it reshapes the same psychology. The rebel who preaches against money but offers no security finds few followers. The radical who demands sacrifice without comfort inspires only the desperate. To break obedience, one must not simply destroy fear, but replace it with another vision of safety. This is why revolutions so often trade one elite for another. The people do not abandon obedience. They redirect it. They trade one source of wealth for another, one set of chains for chains that feel lighter. True freedom, Machiavelli would smirk, is a myth people whisper about but seldom practice. For the wealthy, the lesson is simple. Never allow illusions to collapse entirely. Let people grumble, but give them hope. Let them envy, but give them consumption. Let them dream of escape, but keep them tethered with debt, desire, and recognition. Manage their fears carefully, feed their illusions consistently, and they will remain obedient for generations. This is not cruelty, it is strategy. For Machiavelli, cruelty lies in neglect, in allowing chaos to devour order. The strategic use of fear and illusion, he would argue, is mercy disguised as discipline. And so, the cycle endures. People obey the wealthy, not because of brute force, but because wealth colonizes the deepest parts of human psychology: fear of loss, hunger for recognition, longing for security. Money is not the chain, but the mirror in which people see their vulnerabilities reflected. It shows them what they crave, what they dread, and what they cannot imagine living without. That mirror terrifies and seduces all at once. To resist it would require a rejection of fear itself, a rejection of comfort, a rejection of illusion. Few are willing to pay that price. Thus the wealthy continue to rule silently. Their commands are not shouted, they are whispered, through markets, through culture, through the fabric of daily necessity. Their power is not displayed with swords, but with signatures, not with armies, but with contracts. And their obedience is not coerced, but volunteered, sustained by illusions so elegant that most never question them. Machiavelli would bow his head at such mastery, for it proves his timeless point. Men are not governed by virtue or reason. They are governed by fear and by the hope that fear can be delayed. In the end, the psychology of fear and money reveals a truth both bleak and liberating. Bleak, because obedience to the wealthy is woven into the fabric of human survival. Liberating, because to see the illusion is the first step toward agency. Machiavelli did not promise freedom. He promised clarity. To understand why people obey the wealthy is not to escape the chain, but to finally see it, and perhaps, in seeing, to decide whether to wear it quietly or to break it at whatever cost.